Welcome to Business Ethics. I'm Tom. Today we are talking about Aristotle's virtue ethics. Um, Aristotle's virtue ethics differs from the other ethical theories that we have learned in some important ways, right? The way in which I like to introduce Aristotle is by kind of summing up virtue ethics in a very simplistic way, which is to say that virtue ethics sees ethics as a matter of being a good person. Okay. Um, that's it. Now, there's a lot actually packed into that. You might hear that and think, well, what kind of ethics course is this? I already know that being ethical is being a good person. But that's there's a lot in there, right? Let's start off with the most significant one, which is the idea that it's about being a good person, right? Aristotle's virtue ethics is what you an agent-centered theory, right? What we evaluate as being good or bad, moral or immoral, is a person, their character, not just their actions, right? The other theories, right, deontology, consequentialism, are concerned with what it is to do the right thing. They want to know their act-centered theories, right? They're evaluating individual actions. So this is unique in the sense that Aristotle wants to look at the whole person, their overall character, and kind of look at, when we're talking about character, you're talking about someone's kind of disposition, someone's tendency to do the right thing, right? Rather than just what the right thing to do is, right? So that's a big deal. The second thing to mention is this idea of being a good person, right? Aristotle's virtue ethics treats ethics as an essentially practical matter, meaning that it's about actually bringing about good character and not just knowing what good character is, right? Aristotle makes a big deal out of this. He thinks that a lot of ethical theorists are concerned with just knowing what is good or knowing what is right. And they kind of divorce that from the actual practice of being a good person or doing the right thing, right? And he thinks these have to go hand in hand, right? He makes this kind of analogy to other theorists, saying that it's like people who go to the doctor and get the advice from the doctor, but don't do it, right? That kind of advice is useless if you don't put it into practice, right? That's another kind of really significant feature of Aristotle's virtue ethics. And the third thing is it's about being a good person. Well, what is the idea of a good person, right? He has a very kind of sophisticated, or what would you say, robust kind of idea of what a good person is, right? The kind of central thing that the central concept that he's going to use is this concept of eudaimonia, right? Which is translated oftentimes as happiness, although it doesn't really correspond to our contemporary version of the term happiness, right? So before we kind of get into what it is to be a good person or what this ultimate aim is of human character, right? I want to mention that Aristotle's theory is what you call a teleological theory, right? And teleology is really just the study of the aim or the purpose of a thing, right? And this is a big deal in Greek philosophy, and but it's a very simplistic idea, right? The telos of an object is just its aim or purpose, right? So the telos of this video is to watch it, right? The telos of a pencil is to write. The telos of a light is to illuminate a room or whatever space, right? Things have purposes and aims, and that's really easy to see in artifacts and man-made things, right? Because we make them with that telos in mind, right? But you can also think about natural objects as having a kind of telos, right? That has certain kind of purpose or aim that's intrinsic to it, right? So, for example, if it's springtime and there's a line of trees of the same kind of tree, right? And all of them are blooming except for one, right? You'd say, well, something's wrong with that tree. It's not really doing what it should be doing this time of year, right? Maybe it's sick, maybe it's diseased, maybe it's dead, right? There's something that's preventing it from doing what it's supposed to do, which is and fulfilling its purpose, which is bloom in May or whatever, June. Um, so natural objects can have kind of a telos, or if your cat, you notice your cat's not eating, right? You would probably take it to the vet because it's not doing what cats are supposed to do, right? Which is eat cat food, right? This kind of thing, right? So natural objects, animals, plants, these kinds of things have a kind of intrinsic telos, right? They have an aim, a purpose, that's kind of a nature that they're supposed to fulfill, right? And the idea is that human beings are other kinds of beings that have an internal telos, right? And what our telos is, what our ultimate aim is, is what he calls eudaimonia, right? Which is happiness, right? And now happiness, of course, for um, uh, Aristotle is not just, what would you say? It's not just a feeling of being happy. We tend to think about happiness in a very passive sense. It's an emotion, something you feel when certain things happen, something that you don't feel when other things happen, this kind of stuff. I eat ice cream makes me happy, or a cheeseburger makes me happy, or someone giving me a compliment makes me happy. That's not really synonymous with eudaimonia. Eudaimonia has more to do with the kind of satisfaction of the kind of achievement of what you're supposed to be doing as a person, right? So you think about the happiness you gain from graduating or getting a promotion or being a good parent or spending quality time with your siblings or something like this, right? It's a sense of well-being, a sense of some people will translate it as human flourishing, right? You're kind of fulfilling your purpose as person. And it's not very individualistic. For Aristotle, there's kind of like a human nature that we are exemplifying, we're achieving when we reach a state of happiness and eudaimonia, right? So that's kind of the package for this idea of being a good person. That ethics has to do with fulfilling your purpose as a person, as a human being, and that's overall in all aspects of your life, right? Kind of like the whole package, right? Um, so one thing I like to mention at this point is that Aristotle does make this interesting argument that ethics is the most important thing that we could study. And the reason why is because he thinks that all activities that we engage in are ultimately kind of geared towards achieving eudaimonia, right? The reason why we go to school, the reason why we have families, the reason why we travel, the reason why we do art or politics or anything that we do is because we think it's basically going to better our lives, right? It's like what we should be doing to do all the things that we want to do as human beings, right? And so he thinks this kind of ultimate end of happiness or the good, right, is what we are all always aiming at. And so because everything we do is going to be kind of by default geared towards achieving some kind of eudaimonia, right, uh, that it's really important for us to study ethics as the dynamic of developing human character, right, and being good at at life, this kind of thing, right. um, so that's kind of like a general synopsis of the overall orientation of Aristotelian virtue ethics, right? Um, in book two, there's kind of more determinate senses of how this is going to work, right? And there are two main features that I'd like to focus on with Aristotle, right? The first one is that being ethical is a matter of practice, habit, and development, right? What does that mean? Well, Aristotle thinks, as I mentioned, that ethics is a practical matter. It's not just a theoretical matter. It's not just something that we just understand, right? It's something that we have to do. And this is really baked into his overall conception um, of ethics in general, right? So for him, if you think about, I mean, for him, er, ethics is going to be like a skill. It's going to be something you practice, right? Um, and why is this important? Well, think about any other kind of skill that you learn, right? How do you learn how to ride a bike? By riding bikes, right? You get up on there and you got to try, right? You got to get a sense for the balance, right? How do you learn how to play guitar? You have to take out a guitar and start going at it. And you're not going to be very good at first, but you just have to try, right? Otherwise, you're never ever going to kind of learn, right? Same thing with swimming or playing the piano or anything like this, right? You develop a skill by exercising that skill, right? And you do it very rough at first, and then you kind of refine it, right? And this is the way Aristotle thinks about ethics, right? He thinks that the way in which we become a good person is by basically trying to be a good person, right? And we won't be good at it at first, but over time we get better, right? This is very different than lots of ethical theorists that think that what you need to do in order to do the right thing or be a good person is know what the right thing to do is, right? Aristotle kind of thinks you don't have to have all the answers. You can just start to try, right? You can kind of fake it till you make it kind of thing. That's a very different dynamic. And that falls out of this idea that ethics is more like a skill rather than a theoretical understanding, right? Um, and then this also brings in other dynamics, right? So um, he thinks that ethics has to do with this dynamic of development, right? And so things like developing good habits is really important to him, right? He recognizes that our ethical kind of dispositions have to do with all kinds of habits that we develop over time, right? And he also talks about things like moral education, right? That we have to learn how to be good and we have to learn from others, right? Um, and so these kind of come together. If you notice, what does moral education look like? Well, most of us learn from our parents, from our schools, religious affiliations, all this kind of thing. But when you have someone who's very young, right, a kid, that's like 3 or something, you constantly are telling them, use your inside voices, say please and thank you, say please and thank you, don't yell, don't throw, don't hit, right? You say this over and over and over and over again, right? And eventually what happens is those habits get ingrained in them, right? And those habits have moral import to them, right? If you're an adult and start throwing your computer across the room, like, that's bad, right? And we tend to not do that because we've developed a habit to not throw things, right? These kinds of stuff, right? And so Aristotle sees this as all a common trajectory, right? And these habits really have moral import to them, right? So we kind of learn how to be moral by doing moral things, right? Over time. And then the second kind of main claim here is that being ethical is a matter of finding a mean between extremes of excess and deficiency, right? And this is a big deal for Aristotle. This is called the golden mean or Aristotle's mean. And what he kind of says is that the virtues, which are, markers of human excellence, right, are things that are essentially a mean between extremes, right? So my favorite example is something like courage, right? Aristotle thinks that, look, if you have too little courage, obviously that's cowardice, right? But if you have too much courage, that's foolishness, right? And that's not good, right? If you go out into battle against 1,000 soldiers by yourself, right? you're not courageous, you're just stupid, right? Too much courage is bad, right? And lots of other virtues are like this, right? If you have too much or too little, it's not right, right? It's not good. It's not really exemplifying that virtue, right? And so, this meaning, being ethical, is finding that kind of middle road, right? And then this kind of bleeds into like an overall kind of mean of finding a kind of balance in your life, right? For Aristotle, he will say that the this mean does not just apply to the virtues, but it also applies to like emotional dispositions, right? If you are too angry, that's not good. But also, if you don't get angry ever, that's not good either, right? You should have the right kind of anger and the right kind of context, in the right kind of amount, right? Um, uh, so putting all these things together, I think one of the best ways to understanding what Aristotle is up to is to take this kind of idea of being a good person, of achieving eudaimonia, and compare it to health, right? At one point in the text, he says that, being moral is about, doing the right thing at the right time with the right people, with the right intentions, from a firm and immutable moral character, right? And it's like this very holistic package, right? He doesn't want just good intentions. He doesn't want you just to do the right thing. He doesn't want you just to have, good emotional dispositions. He wants you to have all of it at the same time, right? Um, and this is very much like health, right? Health is, first of all, something practical, essentially. You can only be healthy by, knowing facts about what is healthy does not make you healthy, right? You have to do all those things, right? And being healthy is, you really have to do all of the things that are involved, right? You have to sleep right, you have to eat right, you have to exercise, you have to avoid a certain amount of stress, all that kind of stuff, all of it together, right? If you just sleep well, that doesn't help you, right? If you just exercise, it doesn't help you. It doesn't, if you just eat well, it doesn't work, right? You have to do all the things at the same time. And then also, like, if you do too much of any of those things, it throws you out of balance, right? So if you're sleeping too much, that's not good. If you work out too much, that's not good. If you eat too much or too little, right? None of those things are good. You have to kind of put them all together, right? And that's really what Aristotle's kind of looking for, right? And then lastly, what I will say about this is that when it comes to business ethics, there's a lot of crossover. When I compare this idea of moral character to a business as a whole, right? Oftentimes businesses think that they, um, basically, when they have a situation arise, they need to just kind of compensate for it. And they're kind of putting out fires here and there, putting band-aids on things, and just responding to problems in their companies. Aristotle kind of gives us this idea that, what you really need to do is kind of build a company with good values and strong support systems, good lines of communication. You need to hire good people and all this kind of stuff, and really kind of pay attention to the overall kind of structure of that company, right? And then you actually have to implement all these things, and you have to implement them well, and you have to kind of watch and gauge these things. And just like this idea of, like, we talk about healthy workplace, right? And it's about putting all these kind of components together, right? And also this idea that ethics is like a skill, is the idea that it's a practice, right? It's not something that's just going to happen. It's not just like a place just happens to have a healthy workplace or just happens to not. It's about building that and implementing all these kinds of structures and practices, and putting that whole kind of package together, right? So there's a lot of crossover. There's a lot of helpful material here to think about business ethics, and corporate culture and all these kinds of things. So I will leave it there. Thanks everyone for watching, and we'll talk soon.